I'm going to welcome our panel. You guys can all just come up. As it turns out, I know this is the last panel of the day, so you guys are ready for dinner. But this is just terrific work that each one of them has done on a very different subject than we've been looking at today. The panel is called Covering Invisible America. And there's a lot of conversation today about digital disruption and email and confidentiality. And I was thinking, wow, well, this is kind of apropos to actually end the panel, with a panel about reporting on people who don't even have access to the internet or email or healthcare or legal help for that matter. And I think one of the things about covering these folks is you have no choice but to go out into the field and actually report on it. I have to go in order because they have media, so we're hoping to keep you guys all awake with some additional excerpts. But I'm going to start first with Laura Sullivan. She doesn't really need introduction in this crowd. She's an investigative correspondent at NPR. Her award-winning series, Native Foster Care: Lost Children, Shattered Families, showed how hundreds of Native American children in South Dakota are being removed from their homes every year and put into foster care. We've just come off, and I'm going to talk to each one of them, and then I am going to open it up to all of you. Hopefully you guys can be really engaged and ask tons of questions. And Laura, we've just come off a multi-year project actually reporting on a Native American women and abuse, and it's been incredibly tricky with access. So I'm intimately knowledgeable about the amount of access you must have gained and how hard it was. Can you just talk about that?
Sure. So for me, we just finished, right now we're finishing our third project actually out of the reservations in South Dakota, but and some other states. But I guess this all started for me about 5 or 6 years ago when I was doing a story about the rape of Native American women on Indian lands. And it came out of the Justice Department, 1 in 3 Native American women would be raped or sexually assaulted in her lifetime, which was just a crazy figure. And so I thought, let's do a project about this, let's figure it out. And I remember I said to my editor at the time, actually, Ellen Weiss, she's somewhere in there, and she's at Scripps Howard now, but I had said to her, I think we really want to do this mostly out of Oklahoma because we want to deal with the jurisdictional issues in the Justice Department, but this is a huge problem in South Dakota, so why don't we just kind of drop in and we'll just kind of hit that quickly and then come out. And I'm thinking, she's saying, well, how long is this really going to take? And I'm like, well, let's just go spend a day or two there and, let's just, we can get some quotes and it'll be fine. And I had heard from reporters that it could be kind of difficult on Indian reservations, and I thought, well, what could it really be? So I went on the website. This is the reservation I want to go to. It has a government structure. It has a chairman, Ron His Horse's Thunder. That's the guy. We'll just go interview that guy, and maybe we'll come up with a couple other people to interview, and we'll go to Oklahoma. And so I call up the chairman, and to this day, I have absolutely no idea why or how I got him on the phone. But for some reason, I was put right through to him, and I said, I want to do the story about rape on reservations, and this is not something that this should be kind of, in Washington, you want to interview somebody, you call them up. This is not something, you're not asking them about their personal finances or their government finances. This is kind of a no-brainer interview. You make an appointment and you show up and you interview them, and this guy's the chairman of the tribe, so I was like, this is what we want to do. And he said, okay, that sounds fine. And I was like, all right, then, so, how about next Monday at, 1 o'clock, can we come interview you about this? And he's like, yeah, that sounds fine. I said, okay, great. I hang up the phone. I'm like, how hard is that? What are people talking about? So we fly out there Monday. We arrive. We drive, hours into the middle of nowhere. And we show up precisely at 1 o'clock. We walk into the government building. It's kind of a cinder block kind of government building, but not a lot of trappings. But we get in there. There's an administrative woman. We ask her, okay, we're from NPR. We're here to do an interview with Chairman His Horse's Thunder. And she says, okay, well, you can wait if you want. All right. It was kind of a weird response, but all right, maybe he's busy. So we sit down and we wait for a long time. And about an hour later, I'm with my producer Amy Walters and I'm like, do you think he's like on a conference call? I mean, what do you think's going on here? Because nobody's coming in and out of the office. We're the only people there. And so finally, after another 20 minutes or so, I say, do you think that the chairman will be free anytime soon? I mean, do you think that he might be able to do the interview at some point? And she goes, well, he's not here. And I said, but we have this interview, do you know where he is? And she leans back and she literally goes, Louisa, do you know if the chairman's coming in this week? And I said, this week? And she goes, I don't think so, I think he's out at his cabin. Okay, so I say, well, do you think that can we get to the cabin? No, it's like on the other side of the state. It's really far away. It's a dirt road. Doesn't have an address. You're never gonna find it. Okay, so we have a bigger problem than I thought. So we ended up, I was like, now what are we gonna do? Because that was our interview. So we decided that in some basic research that I had done, that there was a women's shelter, and I thought that we might go by it. And by women's shelter, I mean there's a woman who opens her house to other women in trouble. It's not an official women's shelter. It's not funded by anything. And so we literally traipsed, an hour across the reservation to some other place and found this woman's house. And that was, I guess, the first time that we actually started realizing that this was going to be a lot harder than we thought it was going to be. She was gracious and she let us come in, and we had nowhere else to go, really. We didn't know anybody. And so we just started talking to her about her experience, what she was doing, and she was receptive. But and there were a lot of women that were coming by. She had said, you can stay and hang out if you want, and there are some women coming, and I was saying, well, what time are they coming? And later. When are they coming? Later. Okay, so we're kind of getting the sense that time is not the way it is in DC. It's a very fluid kind of thing in Indian country. And she was like, why don't you stay and you can meet some of them. And for the next 2 or 3 days, that's all we did. And it didn't go particularly well. By the third day, because when you're coming into Indian country, and this is something we learned pretty quickly, and you're not native, and in our case, white, you are either, and if you're at the county government, you're there to do some sort of land deal that does not benefit the Indian tribe. If you're showing up at their door and you're a white man, mostly a white man basically, because it's not very diverse in South Dakota, you're there for some sort of law enforcement purpose. And if you're a white woman, you're from social services and you're there to take their kids. And that was pretty much the standard way that you're viewed as an outsider. And so a lot of the women that were coming by and coming through were friendly, but they didn't really want to talk to us. They didn't really know what we were doing. By the third day, it was getting a little better. You guys all know how this goes. It's just like presence and talking, and we don't even have our recording equipment out at this point. We're just literally sitting on this woman's couch eating Cheetos. That is what NPR is paying me to do for hours on end. And people are coming in, and we're finally like, the woman who ran the shelter was no longer introducing us as, I don't know, these girls from out of town are here, they're journalists. They're doing a story about rape, and they're doing a story about what's happening to all of us here on the reservation. And that was helping a lot. I mean, it was helping to build some trust. And, it was kind of boring sometimes, and people would say, do you want to, you should talk to so-and-so, or I remember this one woman came in, she's like, do you want to come out to, she's like, well, do you want to come by, my son died, and about a year ago, do you want to come see where he went off the ravine and died? Okay, sure. So we got in her car and we drove around for a long time, and then we saw it, and I remember we stood over the ravine, and she said it was really sad, and she was crying, and she was telling us a story which had nothing to do with the story we were there to do. And she said, there was an officer from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. He doesn't work here anymore. He's like long gone. But I keep in touch with him because he was really helpful to me. And I just remember it was, sometimes I talk to him still. His name was Doug Wilkinson, and I was like, okay, that's great. And so we drove back, and then, I remember asking the woman at the shelter, well, women were starting to say, well, you should talk to this person, or this is what happened to me. And I would say, well, can we call them and have them come over? And finally, because I couldn't understand, why we couldn't just reach out to these people and just have them come and meet us or go to them. And finally, the woman at the shelter said, because it's the end of the month, none of the cell phones work. And I was like, Right, because you're out of minutes, right? And this is poverty. And so, and not only are you out of minutes, but you're probably out of electricity. So people don't want to have guests over because it's embarrassing, especially the two girls from out of town. So finally, there's a lot of driving around to find people. So if you want somebody, you know, well, then she was like, Shirley, can you take them over and maybe find this person and talk to this woman? And so by day 4, I would say we have made, you know, I'm sort of calling the editor, it's going great, it's going really well, you know, but, you know, number of actual usable interviews is 0. And, but number of friends made, growing, you know, growing. And we kept hearing about this. You know, it was like, well, can you, you know, I think you should go interview Shirley, and I can take you over there, and we'd drive for a while, and then we would stop at somebody else's house, and then they would know where Shirley was, and then Shirley would be somewhere else, and we would go around. And every time everybody would go to somebody else's house, they would bring something. Like,
So Laura, can you just sorry because I love your story.
This has an end.
We could just roll with you because you're no, you're wonderful. I think you're terrific. I'm so curious how you got to the father.
I know.
No, I mean, every one of us really relates. This is like really group therapy because it's really important. It's group therapy, right? I mean, how many people are with her out on the road? This is like a nightmare, I guess.
All right, but the 3 points are seriously, time doesn't matter. Always bring a gift, which is tricky as a journalist because you're not supposed to bring anything. And you're not supposed to pay for information or sources, but it is Lakota and Nakota tradition. And the food issue, this is 6 of the 10 poorest places in the country, and they want to feed you, which is incredibly difficult to deal with because it's hard to take something from people who have nothing, and they all feed you. And to this day, 4 weeks ago, it drives me insane. But I have to just tell you the end of this. So the woman, I do. This is the whole point of this whole thing, is that she was like, you have to talk to this woman who knows the story of Leslie Ironroad, who was recently raped, assaulted by 4 men, beaten to an inch of her life, and then died in the hospital. And there was never a police investigation of any kind about this, and we all know who did it. It's these 4 guys who live in that house right there. And we eventually found Leslie Ironroad, and we found the friend of Leslie Ironroad, and she said, I was there when she reported it, because the police were like, we don't know about this, they never reported this crime, what are we supposed to do? Women don't report it to us, this is Bureau of Affairs, there's nothing we can do. And this woman, Rhea Archambault, said, I know she reported it because I was in the hospital room and she reported it, and we gave it to the BIA police officer, and I know that she reported it. And I said, do you have any idea what that guy's name was? And she said, Doug Wilkinson. And I said, nobody knows where Doug Wilkinson is, but I just stood on a ravine with a woman who knows where Doug Wilkinson is. Wow. And so he confirmed the entire story. So here in America is a woman who was raped, assaulted, and died at the hands of 4 people, and not a single federal prosecutor, law enforcement, or local police official cared enough to open an investigation. Nowhere else in America does that happen. That's my story.
Thank you. That was worth it.
Sorry.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you. A.C. Thompson, he's a reporter for ProPublica and a great friend of Frontlines. I think we've done some of our most important work with A.C., from Law and Disorder to his work on postmortem to the child cases. He's just an incredible reporter. We're working with him on 2 pieces now. One actually in the capacity as producer. He's actually come with us on a producing journey, which is quite something. And he's really been focused lately on crimes against elderly Americans. And his article, Gone Without a Case, identified dozens of cases in which the neglect, abuse, and even murder of seniors was rarely investigated. And clearly, this is going to be a topic of discussion for all of us. And I just wanted to know, I've been actually meaning to ask him this for like 3 years. I haven't had time. We've been so busy. Why the elderly? I mean, you've been reporting on many different topics and people. So why the elderly? What's your fixation on this?
So the story behind the story goes something like this. One of the things that compelled me to start looking at older Americans was a ride I had around the East Bay with my friend who is an EMT. He drives an ambulance. And what he does mostly is he drives old folks from nursing homes and assisted living facilities to hospitals when they need medical care. And I said, so what do you see? And he said, some of these places are fine. And I said, and the others? And he said, and the others are not. And he said, what I see people who have urine all over them because they're incontinent and nobody is changing their adult diapers. He said, I see people who have fingernails and toenails that have grown into long, crusty claws because no one is cutting their nails. I see people with matted, tangled hair because nobody is brushing their hair. I see people in soiled sheets and soiled clothing who've been forgotten, who have been completely forgotten. And the reason I'm transporting them often is because they have a serious medical ailment that could have been prevented if they'd actually just gotten decent care and someone cared about them. And he said, this is a hidden world. This is a world you don't have to deal with and you don't see. And these are the forgotten people of America. I see them every day. And this is the thing you got to understand about the conversation is my friend is not a Captain Sentimental. He's not an emotional guy. He's a tough guy. He's a former Golden Gloves boxer. He came up poor and hard and tough. And he started getting really emo on me about this. And I thought, if this guy is this upset about this, I need to start looking into it. And that's what prompted one of the things that prompted our investigations. The clip you're going to see is what happens when a coroner in Little Rock, Arkansas decides, hey, I'm actually going to really look at what happens when old people die in nursing homes. And what he found was not pretty, as you'll see.
Irene Askew was a Little Rock resident who was active in the civil rights movement.
My mom was born in 1910, so she could tell me stories of things that happened to our race then that it's not pleasant to talk about, but she did talk about it and encourage us to go to college so we could take care of ourselves.
When Irene was 82, her family put her in a nursing home called Riley's North after she broke her right hip. Her daughter noticed that she soon began developing massive sores.
The main thing was going on that they were not getting her up and not turning her and letting her sit there all day long on the pressure area.
Irene Askew's pressure sores grew so deep that her spine was visible to the naked eye. But even as she began to rapidly decline, the sores received minimal treatment by the staff at the home.
Mama went there in July, and by November she had passed, just at that time.
You can see the severity of these pressure sores. That's not acceptable ever. The fact that it was allowed to get to these type of situations where you can literally look through a person through their pressure sore, that's a contributing factor.
And if you had just gotten a death certificate filled out by a doctor associated with the nursing home, do you think it's going to say contributing factor, pressure sore?
Most likely not. Without the law in place, without the investigative tools that we had, she would have been listed as a natural death. She would have gone on to be buried and had her funeral and final disposition, and that'd been it.
Instead, Riley's North, the nursing home where Irene Askew died, was permanently shut down.
People were sending their relatives, and a lot of people didn't know what was happening. But with his investigation, this was the greatest thing that could have happened because it closed them down. It was just that bad. They closed the facilities. Now you know that is bad when they close the whole home.
I actually wanted to just, I heard a lot of you guys groaning when you saw those stills. And I wanted to say that actually AC and I have had quite a robust back and forth about whether to even show those images to you. And I just want to say AC made a compelling argument that we need to start showing these images. And we just made the argument on our Tuesday night Syria show where we showed you what's actually happening in Syria. So if Frontline's going to do anything, we should start showing you this type of stuff so you can understand why it is that the elderly is actually dying. And that's why. It's because these are crazy infections that get out of control and then they perish. So I think there's just a great conversation happening right now about what images to show and not, and so far so good. Thank you, AC. So Ryan Gabrielson, he reports for the Center for Investigative Reporting. Congratulations, you just got a Polk for Broken Shield. He just got back. His work is amazing, right? I mean, he did some great work for us also in collaboration with us on postmortem, and I'm really glad you're on this panel. Thank you. The latest work he's been doing is looking at the systematic failure to investigate crimes against severely disabled patients. What I was so intrigued by and curious about was, however do you report on people who can't even speak for themselves, especially the severely autistic in a couple of cases you were telling me about? How do you start doing that?
Yeah, it's a reporting problem, no question. And there's multiple parts to it. So the biggest hurdle is you can't get inside these facilities without signing like a media access release in California, where they will guide you step by step and control who you can talk to and who you can't. So assuming that you go through that, a lot of these folks can't talk. These are some of the most severely disabled people that we have, the most vulnerable as a result as well. Cerebral palsy, profound mental retardation, and severe autism, as you mentioned. One of the issues with the investigations is that they are automatically deemed not credible, and so they're discounted right away. So you have to look for people who obviously can talk, who know their stories intimately, and who love these people, and who've known them their whole lives. So you start looking for family. But not even that is easy. So when I was well into the series, I'd been told that there was this horrific case out of the Sonoma Developmental Center in which a whole bunch of patients had been tased for recreation by a caregiver. And it took me months of finding the right set of sources in different parts of the State Department of Developmental Services to leak me the source documents, because you can't get them. The state of California criminal investigative files are sealed for all eternity, and records related to the care of the developmentally disabled are deemed confidential. Another reporting problem. So pretty much everything important had to be leaked. But when I finally got these records and was able to find out there were 12 male patients across a few units at Sonoma who'd been hit with stun guns. They had paired circular burns. I had a list of names, and I started trying to find their families. And I finally found one set of parents who lived not too far away from the Sonoma Center. And so I go and I knock on the door, and I ask it to talk with them. I say, I'm working on a story about what happened to your son. And the mother screamed at me, "We'll talk to you when we see your 3-part series about abuse in group homes." Group homes are community facilities. There's a war in care for the developmentally disabled between community placement and state-run institutions and developmental centers. And they wouldn't talk to me because they were so scared that they were going to lose the developmental center.
Wow.
So the cases where I had success in getting families to talk to me all involved, for the most part, death at the hands of another.
Right. Wow. Interesting. I was thinking about the importance of this kind of work. In addition to just the personal stories, I think it's like what Phil Bennett and many others are calling accountability journalism, right? The question of you have personal stories, but then the bigger questions, the systematic failures behind it are crucial, right? And so that's, I think, really what each and every one of you is doing. So we'll be opening this up for questions soon, but I next wanted to introduce June Cross. She's an associate professor of journalism at the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. She's what she called the founder and the runner, I love that word runner because it's true, of the documentary program there. And I am a graduate of that school, not Berkeley, have to say, so I have been watching as a lover of documentary. When is Columbia, when are they gonna get with a program about documentary film? So I've been watching with admiration as you build that into the DNA of Columbia. I'm much appreciating it. Today she's going to talk about her own film, and this is long in the coming as well, again, about people who devote years of their lives to telling a story. And this is a documentary about rural African American women Infected with HIV in the South. She profiles in particular a South Carolinian family facing this disease together. It's profound stuff, and she's going to show us a clip and then talk about that family and why that family.
We just see the clip first.
Yeah, you want to just go ahead, that's fine.
At one point, I was real upset with her because I thought a mother would love her children good enough to give up the drug and alcohol and at least be a parent. I love Tony and I love Dayshell, but I just feel like Daisha got the short end of everything. I don't have all this education to get jobs, and it really ain't no jobs. They took all the factory work from us. I don't read and write, but I've made it. I do home health care in my home. I have different kind of jobs. I take care of some cattle for some man, and I pick peas, and I pull weeds out fields, and I make enough to live without begging. And I can have pride and be happy of who I am. I've lost my house 2 or 3 times. The state used to help me pay some bills, but then they said all the funds was gone.
So that's 62-year-old Wilhelmina Dixon, who works as a home health care aide but has no insurance herself, and she has 5 family members who are infected with HIV. When we started shooting this in 2009, it was about the same time as the national health care debate began. President Obama declared a national HIV strategy, which is very far-reaching, but it doesn't reach the end of the dirt road a mile from the state capital of Columbia and about a half hour from Aiken, which is where Wilhelmina Dixon lives, really in a family compound. They all have a group of trailers, and they all live together there. She has a daughter who is a drug addict, Tony, who also dies horribly in a nursing home with very similar kinds of images. And her daughter, Tony, gave birth to Wilhelmina's granddaughter, whose name is Dayshell, who was born in 1992, and had she been born anywhere except in rural South Carolina, that was the year that doctors realized that if pregnant mothers took AZT, they wouldn't pass on the virus to their children. But Dayshell has been living with HIV now for 19 years and coming of age in a town of 2,000 people as a teenager when you're the only kid in town living with HIV is no small thing. So this is a film that explores sort of the space between what the public health officials in Washington and the disparity between what the public health officials say and what is actually going on the ground. I chose South Carolina because Governor Nikki Haley has been a vocal opponent of affordable care. She was one of the first governors to join on the Supreme Court fight against the Affordable Care Plan, and she insists that she's not going to expand Medicaid. So she's determined that there will be no expansion of the Medicaid waiver. The name of this panel is very interesting. They talk about Invisible America. These are not invisible people. They're not ectoplasms from Hollywood. They're people that we choose not to see. And in South Carolina, folks like Wilhelmina who are poor and uneducated have been failed by the public education system. People refuse to see them. The politicians refuse to see them. You can't even bring up the whole idea of HIV on the state floor. It's never been mentioned. There's never been a debate in the state legislature about trying to have prevention funds for HIV in a state like South Carolina. So it's one of 9 southern states that are like this, and the South has got increasingly more and more people, more new cases of AIDS than any other region in the country. So that's what it is, and Wilhelmina and her family represent that cohort.
Thank you. She also shared with me that she has a rough assembly, and she has been working away at trying to get this in a line. It's hard work. Thanks. Meg Kissinger has been writing about mental illness for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel for more than 2 decades. Your work is extraordinary, and your dedication to this issue is amazing. Her award-winning story, Imminent Danger, is about the dangerously mentally ill and the failure to identify them and get help for them, often with tragic consequences. Meg, I want you to talk about your own work, but I'm so curious about how you've reacted, knowing so much about this particular issue, with how the media has covered Adam Lanza and other recent cases in that realm.
Well, it's
You don't have to be polite.
I don't have to be
You
polite. Okay,
shouldn't be
great.
polite, because people need
all
to,
right.
you know.
It
Not recording.
sucked.
Yeah. I figured you would say that. Tell us why.
It's
You can
actually
even
way,
you can
it's
even
way
talk about
sucked.
Frontline.
Well, and actually that's very flip. And I think I got scared when I wrote an essay for our paper, about what that story appeared 1 year and 1 day before Sandy Hook. And the whole premise of that is, what can we do to find people who, by virtue of their mental illness, are dangerous, which is a tiny sliver of the population of people with mental illness. It's something like 1 or 2%. So it's the third rail of discussion of mental illness, and you walk into a snake pit when you raise this question. And advocates for people with mental illness do not like that question being asked. And my answer to them is, well, how about the people whose lives it affects? And I'm just going to tell you a super quick story. A woman I know came up to me as I was working on this story, and she said, I understand that you're doing this story. My son is having the worst time. We can't get him to take his medication. What should we do? And I said, I don't know, because I'm a newspaper reporter, but you should, good luck. Anyway, 3 weeks later, that's her son in the orange jumpsuit.
Oh, wow.
He killed his grandfather with an axe. And that woman who came up to me that morning found her father bludgeoned to death with her father's blood on her son's tennis shoes. So we need to ask these questions. We need to ask, what can we do to better identify people, even though it's a tiny segment of the population, and nobody likes talking about committing people against their will, but some people are so ill that they need to be safe. Jared Loughner came out of his stupor in prison and was so bereft, so grief-stricken with what he had done. A lot of people, when they're in the throes of very serious psychotic mental illness, don't appreciate that they have mental illness. So what do I think, how do I think they did after Adam Lanza? Well, first of all, Asperger's syndrome, really, that's not gonna make you dangerous by virtue of having Asperger's syndrome. In a way, I'm so excited that I'm getting all this company now in covering mental illness, and I invite all of you to write about this topic because it's very important, and it's something that we all need to do. So the Adam Lanza coverage was very bad at first, but now we're being forced to talk about that, and that's a good thing. And finally, after I wrote that essay, and I heard these conservative talk radio people praising my articles because that's kind of a trap door, then you don't have to talk about gun control, I thought, hey, this issue does not have an ideology attached to it. It's not conservative, it's not liberal, it's not red or blue, it's human beings and their lives, and we need to pay attention.
Great, thank you. Okay, you guys, we have to get some good questions. Let's just open it up to questions now ahead of dinner. And somebody will walk around, so you don't even need to get up. So raise your hand. You've got really great people sitting here to talk to. Yes, there's a woman in the front. And can you stand up and just tell us who you are?
My name's Antonia Uhas. I'm a fellow with the Investigative Reporting Program. And I would just like to hear more from June talking about your process of making this documentary, the challenges in reaching out to this population, and then also just the challenges of trying to report for many years on populations
Yeah.
that much of the media is necessarily interested in hearing about?
Right. Okay, yeah, it's a great question. The first thing is that these are folks who live off the grid. Wilhelmina and her family didn't even have computers. She doesn't even have a cell phone, actually. So whenever I wanted to call her, I had to call a neighbor, and the neighbor would have to walk over to her house, and then she would have to call me back. That finally eased up when a couple of years later, she had a husband died, and then she got a pension, so now she has a cell phone, but at least she has a phone. These are folks who are struggling every day, and every day is a hustle. And so when I show up with a camera, I become one more element of the hustle. So verification is really, really tough. And then she's living at she's sort of living in an environment because she's poor and uneducated and black, and she's dealing with institutions that are by and large hostile to poor people and definitely hostile to African Americans. Yeah, verification was crazy. I mean, when her daughter died, I actually I was there because I had refused to do this story for like 2 years. I've done 3 stories with people who are living and dying with HIV and AIDS. And I was just like, I'm done, I don't want to do another one. And Wilhelmina sent me some video of her daughter in this nursing home and said, you've got to come down here and help me get her out of here. So I went down and I found her, and she died the next day. Then Wilhelmina wanted to get the medical records from the nursing home. They wouldn't give them to her, even though by South Carolina law she was entitled to them. Then the nursing home had like 5 different reasons why they couldn't come up with them, and then if they delayed 3 days, then she had to wait a year, and she had to go through a legal process. She's uneducated. How does she go through this process? And then she's trying to get me involved. I've now been with her for 3 or 4 years, so it's very difficult to maintain that, good luck. Yeah. I'm just a reporter, good luck. I'm not here to help you. But then at a certain point, I can't figure out how to report the story if I don't know what actually went on. So I'm not her advocate, and I'm trying to work outside of her advocate, but I'm working in a small town where rumors abound. Trying to get access to records is difficult unless I'm there. People don't answer the phone. It's like being on Indian country. They're not going to talk to me from New York. I either have to get a cell phone that has their local area code, or else I show up down there in person and make friends with the county clerk, and I find out, oh yeah, I know Wilhelmina. I used to care for her oldest son. And then it's a whole different thing. But and then being a black woman with dreadlocks in South Carolina is a whole other issue, which we won't go into. I've been stopped by the state police several times. It's an interesting conversation. So maintaining boundaries has been tough, and then just raising the money to get down there. I mean, I literally, for the first 2 years, I was trying to do, I know this is going to sound outrageous to print people, but I did the first basically 2 or 3 years on $50,000, which is a lot of money for print people, but for those of you that make docs, that's peanuts, right? So, we were going back and forth a lot, and it's been it's a process. But most of it is just trying to, because these are not public officials, they don't understand what this whole reporting and ethics and boundaries thing is about. And it gets very, very slippery. And so that's been the biggest obstacle.
Thanks, June.
Drew Sullivan from the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. When writing about invisible people, what was the response? I mean, do you feel that you got an invisible response from the readers and the viewers, or did you get more of an impact than you thought?
Who are you addressing it to? Just anyone? Oh, who do you want? You get your pick. And actually, I thought June's distinction about the word invisible was really provocative. It's just like we choose not to see them. They're not actually invisible. We should come up with a better word. We have to think of something. But who do you want to ask a question of?
Whoever's got something to say on it.
Well,
Ryan?
I've actually, so, yes, there's, I was terrified of that there would, I was worried the reason that nothing had ever happened, no one had ever reported, really dug into this in this way before, was because that no one cared, and that we were going to publish, and everyone was going to shrug. It was the exact opposite. People were outraged. They were furious, and they wrote to their lawmakers, and in no time there were hearings being called and bills being introduced to thank you. It was heartening. I mean, some of the people, they didn't like reading the stories necessarily. In fact, I'll never forget this one tweet. The guy tweeted this, the narrative story about a 50-year-old man who died from a broken neck at one of these institutions, and he'd been almost certainly put in a headlock by a caregiver. And the tweet said, "I wish I hadn't read that." But he marked it must read. So, you know, it's, sometimes we don't think that people, if it's painful and, storytelling, that, people might not be willing to invest in it. But if you've got the goods, people will read it. And if you've got the goods, people, not always, but most of the time they'll react.
You know what I think the secret is actually is I think you get a lot of sympathy fatigue sometimes when you do just the sad story of the poor person and whatever, but if you give them somebody to be angry with, if you tell them in the story who's to blame and who's at fault, then you can get them fired up, and it seems to hang on that sometimes.
Yeah. Well, and I think part of what worked for my story is it wasn't just another story about abuse in an institutionalized setting. My way in was this weird police force that was in-house that was supposed to be investigating the people that they work for. And that was my way in, and I was able to find, okay, there's hundreds of cases of substantiated patient abuse, and no prosecutions are coming out the other end. So I could measure it too. So I could not only prove that the abuse was happening, but that they weren't, because of their severe disabilities, they weren't getting justice.
Oh, that's interesting. Who else? I see someone. Oh, there you go. Hi. Just tell us. Oh, we have two. Oh my God, what do we do?
I can yield.
I think the young guy goes first. Go for it.
Hi, Tom Fuentes, retired from the FBI, and now I'm an occasional talking head on CNN. And I wanted to get to a point that AC brought up in showing the pictures of the wounds. And I want to relate that basically to what happened at Sandy Hook. And what I want to bring up is that if you told that entire story and basically said people died because of pressure wounds, which is basically, so the next question would be, what's that? Well, it's kind of like a bed sore. They died of bed sores, so what? It only has the impact when you show the pictures of those bodies of exactly what happened to those people. And relating that to Sandy Hook, and I don't know, many of you I hope aren't as sick as me, but when TV is on and they're about to show something gruesome and they say, I might be in the other room listening, and the reporter will say, you might want to turn your heads, this is going to be sensitive. I come running into to see what are they going to show. It's usually nothing. But the reason I bring that up is I went on the air the day of Sandy Hook. And as I was driving in to go to CNN, I hear the description of the reporter talking to first responders saying that what they saw in that school they described as carnage. Now, I was a street cop for 6 years. I was the Bureau's first commander in Iraq, and saw bodies and body parts and all that. And as a former law enforcement officer, to describe a dead body as carnage is different, because when people are shot, and those of you that have seen shot people, pretty clean wounds. Usually, sometimes you can't even find the wound. And you see the body on the ground. You may not even see where the hole was. Doctors may initially in the emergency room not find it. So that's not carnage. So to go into that school and find 20 dead children and 6 dead administrators shot to death, it would be sad and horrible and terrible, but the cops wouldn't call that carnage unless later, when hearing that it was a 223 round bullet that hit them, and some of the kids hit 3, 5, 7 times by a bullet that oftentimes, when it hits a body, acts like a chainsaw. What those kids were put through, if those pictures were on television, if those pictures were shown to the congressional committees, that would be the bigger game changer than having crying parents or reporters or first responders saying that what they saw was carnage. I gotta believe it was for real carnage and would make those pictures that you just show look mild. And so that brings up the point of comment more about showing that kind of gruesome pictures in public to let the public know what are we talking about when people get shot with that kind of weaponry. Thank you.
Thanks. As long as there's meaning behind it, right? So that's the question, always with those types of images, is to make sure that there's meaning with it so it's not just gratuitous. And I think this is the question we have all the time. When there's actual real meaning to what we're saying and there's accountability, journalism behind it, it has an even bigger impact. So I appreciate that. So we have, yes, why don't you, yes, hi, thanks for waiting.
Yeah, no problem. I'm David Brodsky with OpenWatch. We're an on-the-record muckraking platform based in Berkeley. I want to know, the stories that you all talk about are great examples of a very focused problem in an area. They all have ramifications nationwide. What do you do? Where do you see your role in terms of giving readers of your stories ways to act on those stories and ways to bring that story to its full potential across the nation? Thank you.
That's a great question.
It's a really great
Do you
question.
want to take that, Meg?
Sure. I mean, I just, that is, the older I get, the sicker I am of just stories about problems. I want to know about, what's working. And so I think it's very important to highlight, so in my case, find a program that targets kids at risk for mental illness, and how do you get to those kids before the next Adam Lanza comes along, or Jared Loughner. And people crave that. It's very hollow to read a story just about something awful that went wrong without I hate that word empower, but I guess people like it. How to empower readers, because I think that's one of our big missions, right? Is to open people's eyes, but also to inspire them to make the world a better place.
Do you
like
want to talk about anything specific maybe that CIR is doing, or Brian in that case?
We're definitely, like a lot of people, getting into the business of measuring impact and trying to be more than just pointing out problems. It's tricky. First off, taking developmental centers, it's a very contentious issue about where people should live and who provides better care, group homes versus developmental centers. Right. And there are these horrific things at developmental centers that I've documented. Does that mean group homes are good? Absolutely not. There's good group homes and there's very bad group homes. And the second I say, a developmental center probably should close, I've lost a massive source space. And that's not actually, it's never that simple. And we should be in the business of helping to find solutions, but I'm really wary of ever saying, this is going to work, because when it doesn't, you really have to give it time to be able to measure whether it worked.
Well, I think one of the best things we can do is to write about people, vulnerable people, as human beings, and full-throated, three-dimensional people who are funny, mean, whatever, and as human beings, so that people respond in kind. They're not the mentally ill or the disabled or the cancer patients. They're people with these illnesses. So,
amen.
We have time for a couple of more questions. Yes.
Hi, Grace Rubenstein. I'm an independent journalist here in the Bay Area, and I had this question in mind during the last panel, hoping you guys can maybe tackle it, about the unintended consequences for the the vulnerable people whose stories we tell. As we heard in the story, David Barstow recounted those consequences, even as we fervently hope that the work we're doing and the raising up of their stories in the public view will help them. The systems in which they're living and suffering are so complex that the consequences really are unpredictable. So I'm interested in your thoughts on how far will you go to try to foresee what those consequences will be, to talk through and maybe educate those people about what the consequences might be. Like, how far does our responsibility go?
Laura, why don't you try that one? Because I think that might really relate to some of your reporting.
It's interesting. I'm in kind of a heated debate with an editor of mine right now about it, because we're doing a story on follow-up to our story on foster care, about whether or not to interview this woman who just turned 18 who was raped in a foster home on the air. And I feel strongly that that's something, that's a choice she's going to make at a really young age, that's going to be on our website for eternity. And yes, she's 18. I don't know if she's capable of making that choice right now. I don't know. And I don't know the answer. I don't know the right answer.
So which way are you going? I mean, what are you advocating for with your editor?
I'm advocating not putting her on the air.
Wow. And your editor?
Putting her on the air.
Interesting. We have this discussion all the time, by the way, at Frontline as well.
I had a situation like that too. I mean, we were all sort of rooting for the 18-year-old granddaughter to become more active in speaking out about her HIV, and she finally did. She went to Atlanta, took part in a AIDS Healthcare Foundation march, spoke out, told everybody her story, and she came back and she got totally slammed on her Facebook page. There's this thing now called Shame-a-Ho. You heard this on Facebook, these Shame-a-Ho pages. So she got basically, like, she was slammed by everybody in the local high school for being a hoe because she had come out with HIV, and she's just totally retreated now and won't even talk to me anymore, really. I mean, she just got totally, and that was like one of those things, like, that's the when you're going to foundations looking for the money to do these things, what they want to see is like the character who comes out, takes a stand, I'm going to be an activist, I'm going to go forth, and there was like this hugely triumphant moment, and then she came home and she was just totally torn down.
Facebook.
Yeah, Facebook. Right.
That's great.
Mm-hmm.
Dan Denver at Philadelphia City Paper. I wanted to thank June for her comment taking issue with the whole framing of Invisible America. As someone who's most of my beats are amongst poor people, I really try to resist framing that sort of presumes a middle or upper income readership of like kind of this is how the other half lives. I want my sources or the people like my sources, the subjects of my stories to feel not, I don't want them to feel like the story wasn't intended for them to read as well. So I agree with what you said.
Thank you. I have to thank Dory Maynard, who actually...
Great. I think we have time for one more question. Hi, in the back. I think that would be yes.
I'll talk loud. My name is David Borgman. I'm the editor of the Seattle Times. I'm building off the last question. So if you look around this room, and it's better than it used to be, but it tends to be dominated by white males. These stories tend to, I think, often, we all do them, they tend to have a certain parachuting quality, parachuting into these communities. And communities, when we're talking about vulnerable people, they tend to be people of color and other minority groups. And Laura's story, I think, was a perfect example of how that can be problematic. Frankly, I was surprised that you were surprised at what it's like in Indian country. And I think it underscores
Well, if you've never been, how do you know what it's like in
Well,
Indian
it
country?
underscores how important it is that people who do this work, that we encourage and build diversity far more than we have among the people who do this work.
Are you saying that if I was a Native American reporter that I should have done
I'm
that
saying
story?
if you had
I'm
Native
white, I
American,
shouldn't do
if
the
you
story?
had Native American people among your colleagues, that wouldn't have been a
Our
surprise.
photographer is Native American,
Yeah.
and I work very closely
Yeah.
with him on the story.
I didn't mean to, I'm not meaning to insult you. I'm just underscoring the point that as somebody whose newsroom has done a lot of work on reservations, it wouldn't be a surprise that some of these...
Well, after 7 years of covering Native American reservations, I can tell you that it is no longer a surprise to me that I can't call people at the end of the month. But I think you have to start somewhere. And it upsets me a little bit because it's like saying, well, you've never covered Enron before, so therefore you can't cover
anyway,
Enron.
the point I was trying to make and what I'd like to hear a response to is it, and I'm particularly interested in, I mean, really in the whole panel, how important, or is it important, in fact, that we be far more proactive in diversifying the people who are doing investigative reporting. If you look at even some of the most prominent nonprofits right now, they tend to be dominated by white males. Certainly investigative teams and legacy media tend to be dominated by white males, and I just think it's problematic, particularly when it comes to stories
I
like
agree
this.
with you on the front end that you're probably going to get a better diversity of story idea, that you're probably going to get a better diversity of what problems are out there in the world because people come from different experiences. But I think the ability to be human and interact with other humans and understand who they are and what they do and what makes them tick is the core of what we do. And it doesn't matter who you're talking to or where they're from or what part of the world they live in, that if you can do this job well, it's the ability to connect with other people and to tell those stories. And I don't think it matters who you are.
But I think we all agree as well, right, that the front end of what you said is remarkably true too, right? So I think both are true. One more question, just one more last question. Hi, yes.
Hello? Sorry. Ricardo Sandoval with Human Rights Watch. But after 3 decades as a journalist and an investigative reporter who had the honor of being able to do things that were not related to my being Mexican American, such as covering the savings and loan industry, I think I can relate to what was just said on the panel. Also, my wife, who is blonde-haired and blue-eyed and writes about immigration and was a foreign correspondent in Latin America and got along great and did some great work, I can relate to the comments that were made from the panel. But also, in my 30 years as a journalist, I think a lot of you in the audience know, are probably tired of hearing me saying this, but it has just driven me up the wall for 30 years to come to events and to be invited to speak at some of these events and be asked the question, how do we get more people of color into this game? How do we get more people of color into the mix? And I am glad that Lowell had this panel here today because as a product of one of these so-called invisible neighborhoods and one of these invisible peoples, it's been a uphill battle for 30 years to get that into newsrooms, to get it into investigative reporting. And my question is a follow-up to what Drew had presented. I would like to know what the reaction has been in your newsrooms to this kind of reporting. I've had to counsel young reporters who have been told their stories were great, but it would be great if you didn't have a farm worker as the example. Can you find someone who's a normal person in that community? I've had to counsel reporters, education reporters who've been told, I don't want to hear any more stories about poor people in education. So I'm glad that this is happening. My question is, in the newsroom, is it a fad? Or is it hopefully something that we're finally going to see this change?
AC, why don't you talk about this?
You know, I would say for me, I tell all stories from the street level because that's where I feel comfortable. I tell stories from the ground up. I'll tell you that in my experience with ProPublica and Frontline, they have always supported and been very down for me doing stories that way that look at people on the ground level rather than people in the corporate office suites or at the top of the pyramid of power. And that's been totally supported in my work. So I feel lucky that way. I don't know about other folks, but for me, that's been great.
We work at ProPublica on the Center for Investigative Reporting. I don't know if we actually are able to answer that question because we work at places that desperately want us to chase these kinds of stories. And the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel is a terrific newspaper that I don't know if it's representative of a lot of newspapers where you might hear those comments. Yeah, I mean,
yeah, we're lucky because our managing editor and editor are just dedicated to that, and they support that. They gave me a year, 1 year, to work on that story, and I'm doing a follow-up, and guess how long it's taken me? Another year. So that is terrific support, and I think it's because they know that mental illness is something that touches so many people's lives, and you can't write about it enough.
Thank you guys so much. We'll see you all for dinner.
Wait. This has provoked me to say, on the newsroom question, I have lived in newsrooms of major media organizations where I was told, we can't put those people on TV because no one can understand their English. We're not interested because there's no ratings. And our audience won't tune in to those stories. And so that is not as bad as it used to be, but is still going on today, and especially on the broadcast side. And occasionally you'll see stories that break through that barrier, but I can assure you it's not a regular appetite or something that's coming every day in most of at least the broadcast newsrooms across this country. Which is, I think, why we had this panel and one of the reasons we're doing the documentary you saw a clip of. I want to thank Rainey and all of you guys for showing up. You know, this concludes our program for today, but I want to make sure you understand that at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, I know you have to survive all night tonight, but 9 o'clock tomorrow morning we have a panel on Muckrakers getting published as books, which should be pretty interesting. It's going to be, it's the first time we've done this. It starts at 9. There's breakfast at 8:30. It's down in the library of the journalism school, which is right where the mentorship meetings took place and where we'll have dinner tonight. And Michael Krasny will be the moderator of the panel. And the other panel is, after that, is our normal State of Investigative Reporting panel. And just to liven it up, because I'm usually too tired to do it, I've always done it in the past, we're bringing in Jack Schaefer just to create some trouble. So thank you for being here, and we'll see you at dinner. Oh, and I may tell an off-color true story about organized crime in America at dinner.
I'm right now on America Refrain. Okay. And we'll see if what my